Good afternoon, and thank you for listening to Conversations for College Success. Today's question: what are your basic rights regarding protesting? Sources for this podcast include One Look Dictionary, a blog post, The Constitutional Right to Protest at Universities, May 7th, 2024 by Scott Bomboy, Google search, and Freedom Forum. Let's start with definitions. Protesting: the expression of disapproval of or objecting to something. A protest is a public demonstration, usually expressing dissent. It can be centered around an act or policy of a governing body, the act of objecting, or a gesture of disapproval. A usually organized public demonstration of disapproval. What is protesting behavior? Protest behavior refers to the actions individuals take when deciding whether to participate in collective efforts. The efforts can be influenced by factors such as cost, benefits, and incentives. Protesting is a right, and people have a responsibility to be accountable for their own actions while protesting. Again, protesting is a right, and people have a responsibility to be accountable for their own actions while protesting. The Supreme Court has upheld the right to protest, and the First Amendment protects the right to assemble and express views through protest. This right applies to everyone in the United States, regardless of immigration status. What is the Supreme Court rule on protests? The Supreme Court has long recognized that peaceful protesters cannot be held liable for the unintended, unlawful actions of others. Speech could be prohibited only if the statements met a two-part test. The first one, if the statements were directed to inciting or producing imminent lawlessness action, and were two, likely to incite or produce such action. People are responsible for their own actions while protesting. There's some restrictions on the right to protest, including conduct, how a person uses their right to express their opinion matters. The text of the First Amendment reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." The First Amendment's First Speech Clause restrains governments from preventing people from speaking freely unless their speech falls into several narrow categories of unprotected speech. Types of unprotected speech include defamation, fraud, obscenity speech, integral to criminal conduct, incitement of violence, true threats, and sexual child abuse material. I'll repeat that. Types of unprotected speech include defamation, fraud, obscenity, speech integral to criminal conduct, incitement of violence, true threats, and child sexual abuse material. People must observe reasonable regulations on time, place, and manner. The government may be able to intervene if a protest causes serious disruption. States have a duty to respect, facilitate, and protect the right to protest peacefully. Police intervention must be proportionate and necessary and should do more good than harm. Unrest at universities isn't a new phenomenon. During the Vietnam War era, protests sometimes grew violent and went beyond the scope of permissible conduct protected by the First Amendment. In previous weeks, protesters at multiple universities gathered at encampments, and in one situation, they occupied a building that had also been previously occupied by protesters during the Vietnam era. Here's some other things to know about the rights to protest in Ohio. In Ohio, you can protest without a permit in response to recent events. However, some events may require permits, such as large rallies, parades, or marches that block traffic. There are some limitations on speech and action, including endangering others, blocking traffic, trespassing on private property, interfering with police, carrying weapons or drugs. Private property owners can set rules for speech on their property. It is prohibited to picket or protest within 300 feet of a funeral home, church, cemetery, residence, synagogue, or other establishment during or within 1 hour of a funeral or burial service. How do protests violate human rights? When protesters resort to attacking people, destroying property, whether private or public, they cease to be engaging in a genuine exercise of their right and descend into criminal action. Protests should not be carried out in a manner that undermines the rights of others. The exercise of every right should always happen with due regard to others' rights. The Constitution expects everyone to have regard for all the rights it enshrines. The rights in the Constitution do not place an obligation on state authorities alone, but they place an obligation on private citizens as well, who should respect and uphold the human rights of their fellow citizens. I'm going to repeat that. The Constitution expects everyone to have regard for all the rights it enshrines. The rights in the Constitution do not place an obligation on state authorities alone, but they place an obligation on private citizens as well, who should respect and uphold the human rights of their fellow citizens. This means that individuals must continually ask themselves whether in the exercise of their right, they are not infringing on the rights of other people. Protesters need to refrain from destruction of property in order to make their point. Acts of destruction do not advance, but rather undermine the realization of human rights. Protest action must be conducted in a manner that recognizes the rights of others. Understand how college institutions are governed, and then work together to meet your requests. Presidents report to a board of trustees, and board members could live all over the country. You can request to be on the agenda at a board meeting, or request to meet with the president of your university. I would suggest asking to meet with the president of your university first. Ask what the president could do on their own. However, make sure that you have a presentation to give with specific points, examples, and to make a request of the university. Also ask, what can the university do now to show support of your efforts, and what has to be discussed with the board of trustees and voted on. Examples of previous protests in general include sending troops overseas, use of the death penalty, civil rights, Vietnam, divesting from South Africa, lesbian and gay rights, Israel-Hamas war, and more. Several specific protests, however, follow. Your rights regarding protesting are very important to research first to make sure you do not do anything to cause you or your family any harm. Previous protests in history include Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773. Women's Suffrage Parade, March 3, 1913. Civil Rights Movement marches in Alabama, 1963 to 1965. March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 1963. March on the Pentagon, October 21, 1967. It was opposition to the Vietnam War. Kent State University shootings, May 4, 1970. March for Life, January 1973, and is ongoing. National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, October 14, 1979. Women's March, January 21, 2017. Thousands of women gathered in Washington, D.C. for the Women's March on Washington. 2020 Racial Justice Protests, March to May of 2020. U.S. Capitol Riot, January 6, 2021. Again, sources for this podcast include definitions from One Look Dictionary, Freedom Forum, and a blog post, The Constitutional Right to Protest at Universities, May 7th, 2024 by Scott Bomboy and Google search. Thank you to my dedicated listeners and subscribers, and to my new listeners who I hope will become subscribers. Have a great day. Bye-bye.